This morning, I woke to the sound of dripping. Not heavy, not urgent, just a soft, patient tapping against the hardwood outside my bedroom. When I opened the door, a line of wet footprints led down the hallway, perfectly spaced, already beginning to fade. It hasn't rained in 11 days. I know because I've been watering the lawn myself, dragging the hose in slow circles each evening, watching the sky refuse to change. The windows were closed. The doors were locked. The prints were bare. They started at the front door and ended at the bathroom sink. No puddle, no towel on the floor. Just dark, oval impressions, each one detailed enough that I could see the whirl of toes, the slight inward tilt of the left foot. By the time I grabbed my phone to take a picture, they were gone. The wood had dried evenly, as if nothing had touched it. But the air still felt damp, and I could smell something faint, like lake water trapped in fabric. I tried to shake it off, making coffee as if the morning hadn't started with footprints. The kettle hissed, sunlight streaked the kitchen floor, and the mail lay in a neat stack. Everything looked ordinary, almost painfully so. I wanted it to stay that way. I went to work, letting the hum of traffic and chatter at the office ground me. The city felt distant, irrelevant. I answered emails, signed forms, and nodded at colleagues without thinking. The prints were a shadow I hoped would vanish with routine. Lunch was a sandwich at my desk. I stared at it, mechanically chewing, listening to the printer cough. My coworkers laughed about weekend plans, entirely unaware of the small unease nestling inside me. I told myself it was nothing. After work, I stopped by the grocery store. I walked the aisles slowly, noting the ordinary sights: canned beans, fresh bread, the smell of oranges. Nothing seemed wrong, yet the memory of wetwood haunted the corners of my mind. The drive home was quiet. The city gave way to suburban calm, lawn sprinklers idle, mailboxes lined like sentinels. I parked, unlocked the door, and stepped inside, scanning for signs of intrusion. Everything was exactly as I had left it. I unpacked groceries, methodically arranging milk and eggs. My apartment smelled like fresh bread and soap. The ordinary rhythms, the clicks of the refrigerator, the soft hum of the heater, felt almost sacred. I clung to them, imagining that normalcy could erase strangeness. Evening came, and I cooked dinner while music played softly in the background. The chords were warm, familiar. My hands moved automatically, slicing vegetables and stirring sauce. The prints were still there, somewhere beneath the surface of my mind. After dinner, I sank into the couch with a book. The words were safe, unthreatening. I sipped tea, listening to the city fade outside my window. The world was normal, tangible, and predictable. My feet rested on the rug. The air smelled of chamomile. I checked my phone, messages from friends, notifications, reminders. Routine information, routine lives. Nothing about this, nothing to hint at what I'd seen. I scrolled aimlessly, trying to convince myself the footprints were an anomaly, a trick of tired eyes. Finally, night settled in. I brushed my teeth, washed my face, and climbed into bed. The apartment was quiet. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, willing sleep to come. The prints had receded from view, but their memory lingered, like a faint, unshakable pulse. I woke in the middle of the night to a soft creak from the hallway. My room was dark, lit only by the streetlight filtering through the curtains. At first, I thought it was the floor settling, until I noticed the faint, damp smell again. Sliding out of bed, I flicked the light switch. Nothing. The hallway looked normal, walls, photos, carpet, but the floor was different. Wet footprints led from my bedroom to the kitchen, smaller this time, more deliberate, as if someone had tiptoed in silence. I froze, heart drumming. I touched the floor near the prints. It was dry now, nothing left to feel. I blinked, sure I was seeing things. I told myself it must have been a dream, the imagination stirring after last week's strange incident. I followed them anyway, cautious, each step careful. They ended at the kitchen sink again. No one was there. The faucet was dry. My coffee mug from earlier sat untouched, ordinary, betraying no sign of recent use. I backed away slowly, convincing myself that water from the plant I'd watered earlier must have dripped under the fridge. My rational mind wanted to cling to anything mundane, anything explainable. I cleaned the floor, hoping that would settle the unease. Sleep came fitfully. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the prints forming again, the wet wood glinting faintly in moonlight. I turned over, curled into the blankets, and tried to ignore the sensation of something unseen brushing against the air. Morning brought normalcy, or the illusion of it. I made coffee, looked out the window, and smiled at the sun. Maybe the hallway creak had been nothing. Maybe last night was just an overactive imagination fueled by solitude. Yet, in the kitchen, I noticed something odd, a faint smear across the floor, almost like a tiny trail of moisture. Not a full footprint, just a hint, a suggestion that something had moved where it shouldn't have. I tried to shrug it off, wiping it away. I hummed under my breath, pretending to myself that my life was still ordinary. But when I glanced back at the hallway, I felt the chill of being watched, though nothing met my eyes. By evening, I had convinced myself that everything was fine. I cooked dinner, watched a show, and laughed quietly at a joke. Yet, somewhere, the memory of that hallway creak lingered, a subtle tremor beneath the surface of normalcy. I told myself it was nothing. Houses make noises, floors creak, pipes hiss. I even joked about it to a friend over the phone, laughing too loudly to convince myself. Surely, I thought, a logical explanation existed for a faint damp smell in the hallway. I checked the weather reports obsessively. Clear skies. No rain. No humidity spikes. I measured the floors for leaks, inspected the windows and doors. Nothing. Everything was sealed, pristine, and ordinary. My mind searched desperately for a mundane answer. I bought a moisture meter online, rationalizing it as careful housekeeping. I pressed it against the hardwood. The reading was dry, completely dry. I exhaled, a mixture of relief and frustration. It was impossible. There was no water. I cleaned every surface in the hallway with hot vinegar and baking soda, scrubbing until my hands stung. The air smelled sharp and sterile afterward. I even mopped the kitchen twice. Still, a small, inexplicable dread lingered in the corners of my vision. I began to imagine logical scenarios. A leaking pipe somewhere hidden, condensation from the fridge, a spill I'd forgotten. Each explanation was meticulously weighed and dismissed. None truly satisfied the nagging memory of wet footprints appearing overnight. When I went to bed, I left lights on, rationalizing that maybe shadows played tricks in the dark. I told myself a little anxiety had blown it out of proportion. It was safer to believe in the ordinary than face a mystery I couldn't name. Morning brought a familiar routine. I walked down the hallway, inspected the floor with exaggerated care. It was clean, dry, nothing out of place. I brewed coffee, ate breakfast, and tried to let the nagging memory of the prints dissolve with the day. I spoke to a neighbor about strange noises in houses, laughing nervously when I described my situation vaguely. He shared stories about creaking floors and phantom drips. I nodded, comforted by the human tendency to explain everything away. Work distracted me. I buried myself in emails, meetings, spreadsheets. Every now and then, I'd imagine the prints trailing along the hall. I clenched my jaw and forced thoughts back to mundane tasks. There was no threat, only perception. By night, I was almost convinced I had imagined it entirely. I closed my eyes and drifted off with a rational mantra. Houses make noises, wood warps, floors sweat. Ordinary life was enough. Anything else was nonsense. It started subtly. One morning, I stepped into the kitchen and noticed a single wet footprint by the sink. Smaller than mine, delicate, but unmistakable. I blinked, convinced I had simply missed a spill the night before. By evening, there were two more. One leading to the hallway, one back toward the living room. They didn't follow a straight line. They meandered, as if someone or something was pacing, thinking, testing the boundaries of the space. I began photographing them, trying to convince myself evidence would soothe my mind. Each morning I checked the floors meticulously, mapping every wet trail. They changed slightly each time, angles shifting, lengths altering. Nothing repeated exactly. I noted the timing. Always morning. I was careful with late-night showers, with drinks, with spilling anything. Still, the prints appeared. They respected no household logic, ignoring spills, leaks, or condensation entirely. I started waking earlier just to inspect the floors. The prints were there, waiting. Damp, clean, precise. I traced them with my fingers, feeling the cold wood beneath. There was no residue, no explanation, only an impossible pattern forming beneath my feet. I began to notice variation. Some prints were small, some large. Some faded quickly. Others lingered, clinging stubbornly to the surface. It was as if they had intention, adapting to conditions, observing my reactions. Friends dismissed my worry. Maybe a pet. One said, though I had no animals. Maybe the neighbors? I replied stiffly. My explanations were hollow. My intuition screamed that something unseen was experimenting with the space, mapping me. I started keeping a journal. Each footprint's size, shape, direction, and location logged carefully. The act of recording became a ritual, a defense mechanism. I convinced myself documentation was proof, even if it offered no solution. I began noticing small details in the air. A dampness that lingered longer than it should. A faint, earthy smell, like water from soil. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but paired with the footprints, it made me watchful and uneasy. By the end of the week, I could almost predict the next appearance. Not exactly where, but which room would bear the traces. The pattern was growing, evolving. I realized this wasn't random. Someone, or something, was playing a slow game, and I was the only participant. The following morning, a new element appeared. Not footprints alone, but a smear of water along the baseboards. It was deliberate, as if testing limits, drawing a line I wasn't supposed to cross. Fear crept slowly, a creeping awareness I could not deny. Each night, I lay awake, listening. My apartment was alive with the softest hints, a tap, a drip, a brush against the floorboards. I tried reasoning, tried dismissing it, but the prints had become a presence, a rhythm that demanded notice. One morning, I found them in my bedroom, right at the edge of my bed, what impressions where no one should have walked. The air smelled damp and faintly metallic. My pulse quickened. I had never seen the prints here before. They were different now, too. Some prints were smaller, delicate, almost childlike. Others were larger, heavier. I could sense a presence in the way they shifted through my rooms, like someone knew my habits, my rhythms. I tried sleeping with lights on. I placed buckets of water around the floor, knowing it was irrational. By morning, the prints had avoided every trap. They knew where to step, what to leave behind, and what I might notice. A week later, I woke to find the prints circling my bed. Not random, not scattered. They formed a rough oval around me. I stayed frozen, heart hammering, watching the floor as if it could answer questions I dared not ask aloud. I spoke aloud to myself. There's no one here. This is impossible. My voice cracked, but no one answered. Still, the prints expanded over time, creeping into corners I hadn't thought to check, tracing edges of furniture with meticulous care. Objects shifted subtly. My chair wasn't where I'd left it, a mug tipped slightly, a book out of place. Not much, not enough to suggest an intruder, but enough to whisper that someone or something had been observing me. I started seeing them in other forms, a damp fingerprint on the counter, a smear along the refrigerator door, a faint arc of water along the windowsill. They weren't just appearing, they were communicating, asserting presence in intimate spaces. I tried confiding in friends. They laughed nervously. Maybe a water leak. I shook my head, frustrated. No pattern of plumbing or condensation could explain the precision, the timing, the deliberate circles around my most private spaces. At night, I lay awake, listening. Every tap, every creak seemed magnified, echoing like deliberate footsteps. I began feeling watched, even when awake. My home, the place that should have been safe, felt like a cage mapped by an unseen observer. It reached a point where I would not go into certain rooms. I avoided my own bedroom after dark. I moved furniture to block access. I slept on the couch with lights on, yet the prince always found me, always pressed closer, as if marking me personally, claiming territory within my life. I stopped inviting anyone over. Friends' calls went unanswered. Even family visits were postponed with excuses I barely believed. I couldn't risk someone seeing the prince, the evidence of something my mind refused to fully name. Work became mechanical. Emails, meetings, deadlines, all executed with minimal thought. I couldn't focus on content when each step in my apartment could reveal a trace, a smear, an echo of the unseen. I began sleeping less, avoiding the bedroom entirely. Nights were spent on the couch, wrapped in blankets, ears straining for any sound. The prince adapted to my absence, forming where I didn't go, taunting the distance I tried to maintain. Calls from friends grew tense. "Are you okay?" they asked. I lied smoothly, but the tightness in my chest betrayed the truth. Isolation was no longer a choice. It was a necessity to avoid the unseen, the intrusions, the creeping presence. Grocery runs became stressful, brief, urgent. I left doors open, lights on, as if signaling that someone, or something, was free to move while I was outside. I feared returning home, yet the prince had already anticipated my patterns. I set up cameras, convinced that if I could record the floor overnight, I could capture proof. In the morning, footage showed only empty floors, dry wood, nothing. The prince left no trace on the lens. It was as if the house itself conspired against me. Every sound amplified. A tap of a faucet, the wind against the windows, the hum of the heater. My mind filled in the gaps with footsteps, with wet smears I couldn't see but could feel, trailing me even when alone. I tried leaving the apartment. Hotels, friends' homes, even a night in the car. Yet the thought of the prince remained. My mind had internalized them. I imagined their wet, gliding paths across every unfamiliar floor I walked. By the second week, I barely ventured outside. Food was ordered in, meals eaten cold or reheated in silence. My isolation became a fortress and a prison. The prince had won the war of attention. They dominated my awareness even in their absence. I started whispering to myself, counting footsteps in my head to maintain control. The prince were patient, invisible, intelligent. The apartment was no longer a home. It was a map of my fears, and I was entirely alone on it. One night, I woke to a whisper of movement behind me. Turning slowly, I saw the wet footprints leading to the bedroom closet. My heart sank, but curiosity forced me forward. I opened the door. Inside, the closet was empty. Clothes hung neatly, shoes lined the floor. But on the inside of the door, written faintly in moisture, were words, "I've been waiting." My own handwriting. I recoiled, shaking. I rushed to the living room, inspecting every surface. The footprints no longer wandered. They converged toward the center of the apartment, toward me, forming impossible arcs and shapes I recognized. Diagrams, maps, my life traced in wet wood. Memories came flooding back, sleepwalking as a child, waking drenched in unknown water, footsteps in the hall I'd blamed on imagination. I had been creating them all along, an unconscious echo of myself, marking my own territory without knowing. The revelation was horrifying. The prints weren't external, they were my mind externalized, my body obeying a hidden rhythm. Every trace of water, every smear, every step was an imprint of my subconscious, feeding a cycle of fear I had unknowingly built. I sat on the couch, trembling. I could see them clearly now. The prints, the smears, the distortions in my perception, all a reflection of myself. Alone, yet terrifyingly present, my mind had become both observer and intruder. Weeks passed. I stayed in the apartment, avoiding sleep as much as possible. The prints no longer appeared, yet I felt them everywhere, on floors, in mirrors, under furniture, traces of myself I could no longer trust. I left for a short trip, hoping distance might reset my mind. Returning, the floors were dry, ordinary. But in my bedroom, a single wet footprint led from the closet to my bed, perfectly shaped, impossibly familiar. I tried leaving again, never staying more than a night. Each return revealed subtle traces, a smear here, a footprint there, reminders that the pattern, once begun, was never broken. I was trapped in my own subconscious design. Now I exist in quiet vigilance, walking softly, cleaning constantly, never alone in my own home. Even in daylight, I see what impressions in corners of vision. I have learned one truth. The haunting was never outside. It was always me.